Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Potcotter, and you're listening to CallTalk for February 26, 2020. Today's topic is living wage versus market wage, pros, cons, whys, and hows for contact center managers. If you're listening live, we invite you to be part of the show and ask questions. Here's how you do it. Email me at calltalk@benchmarkportal.com. I want to remind everyone that all of our shows are archived and available to listen to any time of the day at benchmarkportal.com. And now with that, I would like to introduce the host of the show, Bruce Belfiore.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome back to Call Talk, everyone. Today we again welcome Mike Dershowitz to the show. And Mike is a thinker as well as a doer and has put a lot of thought into how employers and managers can create triple win situations where frontline agents and supervisors are empowered and are provided with the skills and the pay to develop themselves and contribute to themselves and those connected with them, their own communities, etc. And where customers interact with employees who are motivated and energized, and where business results are very positive as proven by the metrics. So welcome back to the show, Mike.
Thanks, Bruce. It is great to be here.
Okay, good. Well, our listeners may recall that in the previous episode, back in July 2018, you talked about fair trade outsourcing, sustainable, ethical, and profitable. And we discussed your novel approach to managing call centers for top results while creating social and economic impact. And our focus during that episode was on your outsourced contact operations in the Philippines. Do you want to just sort of recall what we chatted about there, and then we'll dig into today's topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've developed this concept of fair trade outsourcing, and we've recently, changed the name of the company to that as well to try and create this win-win-win for agents, clients, and operators and call center managers. And the overall concept was very much influenced by the fair trade movement. The fair trade movement is one which really looks to say, hey, consumers need to care about what the lives of their producers are like, right? So if you're buying chocolate or if you're buying apparel, what's the condition of the person making that in that supply chain? And as an ethical and moral human being, how are you consuming those goods or making sure that the goods that you consume are fair trade to know that no one has really been harmed in making the goods that you consume? I was very much inspired by this in 2017 after experiences I had operating, a center in the Philippines. And since that program, the concept itself has advanced, quite rapidly, but also, most importantly, we've really started to get a lot of really, really good data about how to more effectively and also really to kind of create some rules about what it means to be a fair trade operator in the contact center world. And that all starts with wages, which is why, Bruce, that when you reached out and said, hey, would you be interested in being back on? And if so, what would you talk about? I'm like, let's talk about wages. Because whenever I introduce someone to the concept of fair trade outsourcing, it's always about, let's start with wages. Let's understand why wages are important. Let's understand how your current wage policy may be actually harming and not helping agents, et cetera. And so I'm very happy to be back to really get into the nitty gritty of that and to help managers understand how they can go from A, which is where they are now, to B. And that is really focusing on the agent journey and how that's going to positively impact your center.
Okay, very good. And the idea that sort of the fair trade concept has moved from goods, particularly things like coffee and cocoa, et cetera, to services like call centers is really interesting, very interesting. I remember talking to a fellow who was with one of the agencies that goes down and actually does the certification for fair trade with coffee in Central America. and sort of talking through the practical elements of all that. So it's really, really interesting. So we're really delighted to have you back on. And today we're really turning our attention to that living wage versus market wage, pros, cons, whys, and hows for the contact center managers. And all about the market and corporate forces, because we got to be practical, right? Many of the people on the phone, some are entrepreneurs and can do it themselves. Others are living within corporate, constraints, but they need to understand so that they can then advocate. These things that push us to offer compensation based on market conditions, and also understand the human and political elements that can push towards offering the living wage compensation, and really. This will, we're asking you to draw on your experiences managing centers in urban America and offshore sites in particular. And we're looking forward to hearing your opinion with regard to the $15 minimum wage. So anyway, let's start with the big picture. Give us sort of an overview of your thoughts on the topic. Then we can drill down on these management issues and approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So the overarching concept, or the way I think that's best for people to visualize how to get this to work right for their individual situations is, I want you to think about really just that old, X and Y axis graph, right? That old X and Y axis graph. And if you think about when you plot a point on an X and Y axis graph, the goal of wages in your contact center is to land at the right place for the type of work as well as the type of company that you are, okay? That's really it. So let's say that X is work and the Y-axis is the type of company, and your goal is to kind of land somewhere in the field where you're going to be able to optimize for what your company is trying to accomplish, okay? That's the overall concept. Now, let's talk about a couple definitions, right? So first off, what is a market wage? A market wage is exactly what it says, which is as a contact center manager, when you post a job opening at a certain rate per hour, let's say, because obviously most employees in the industry are hired per hour, at a certain per hour, does the market respond? Does your local labor market respond? And it's very easy to determine that. Do people come in the door and apply, or do they not, right?
Yep.
And so that's the market wage. And it's different all over the place, right? So that's the market wage. The living wage is something different. The living wage is based off of this concept of consumption. So when economists look at wages, they always look at the labor market and then they look at consumption and they say, what level of consumption is reasonable to sustain for a given geographic area and for a given family composition? So if I'm a single person, right, and I just have me to worry about, I have no children, I'm not married, I'm not living with someone, that's a much different household than if I'm married with 3 kids and so on and so forth. Obviously, and most of us on the phone probably have kids. I know I do. Kids are expensive. Kids are really expensive. And so, really that living wage tries to take into an account what a minimum sustainable level of consumption is that affords someone what's called a dignified or sustainable life, okay? And one that is, free from as much danger as possible. So and the two methods are extremely different, at times they're not super far apart. They're really not. But the concepts are very different. And again, I'll repeat. So a market wage is, I post a job for X dollars an hour, and it either works or it doesn't work. And when that person is hired at that, they can either do the job or not. The living wage says, let me look at consumption. What is sort of the minimum reasonable amount of consumption for someone to live a safe, dignified life, and what does that cost? And that's the big difference.
And obviously there is a huge difference. I have kids as well. Wrote the last check for tuition last year for college.
I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous.
Exactly. You're looking forward to all that.
I don't know if I can see that end line at this point, Bruce. I don't know, man. My oldest is 9, but go on.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people on the phone can, understand that every stage is wonderful in the development of these kids, but everyone has its challenges and certainly its expenses. So the idea that the idea of a living wage for somebody who's single can be very different for somebody who's married, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you aim toward? And does that depend, for instance, on whether you're in a college town and you're basically bringing through a lot of people who are college students working part-time, as opposed to perhaps in a semi-rural area where people need to work full-time, and that might even impact your decision on where to site a call center? What are your thoughts on that? In other words, there's a big range. There may be actually a smaller range between living wage and market wage than there is between living wage for somebody who's single and living wage for somebody who's married with children.
That's right. So, and there is. In general, the living wage for a single person the living wage for a person married with 2 children where the other spouse doesn't work is typically twice, the living wage for a single person, right? Roughly about twice. In a 2-income household with, 2 children, the living wage for that person earning one of those 2 incomes is actually about 60% more than the single person living wage. The challenge is that nationally, in general, starting call center wages are below living wages, okay? Or to continue to use the same vernacular, starting call center market wages are typically below the living wage, right? We see that in our research, we see that in our centers. Not always, but certainly that is the trend, okay? And so that's obviously something that go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask 2 questions there. What is the research that's based on? Because I think a lot of people would probably do a little bit of pushback there. So that's number 1. And then number 2, I'll just add in there, given the tightening of the labor market, is that starting to change because of the fact that we're at a full employment level? So 1 and then 2.
Okay, so you want to take me basically to being my economist side. So fair warning, I probably I'm like a suppressed economics professor over here sometimes. So to answer your first question, there has been no official research within the call center industry to state what is the delta between living wages and market wages within the call center industry. Okay, the research that I am pointing to is a combination of work that we've looked at between the MIT Living Wage Calculator, which you can just find in Google search, great tool. And then in addition to that, the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the data that they make available for the job category, customer service, within the varying economies around the country. Okay, so when you compare those two, in general, you're going to find that it's, that the market wages in the call center industry are below. That's how we do it. And then I have sort of anecdotal evidence of speaking to whether it's companies that I've looked at acquiring, and so I know what their wage structure is, or friends I have in the industry. So I always ask, what do you pay your agents? Because I want that anecdotal data. Maybe that's something that we should do, Bruce. Together is we should commission a study on that, or work on a study, so that the industry has some good work to do. I think that's actually a good idea. So that's the answer to your first question. The answer to your second question, I think really has to do with, when it comes to what should you be paying, well, that's where the balancing act really comes up, right? We go back to that graph that I talked about, X and Y. And the reality is that, in our industry, especially in an outsourced context. So I think contact center managers that are internal versus contact center managers that are within an outsourced business that are in contracts, they're also going to have a different experience. So let me address folks like me first. Those are service providers providing call center services within a service contract. So first off, those folks are going to have it the toughest, right? Because they have to pay for facilities, they have to pay for margin, their own SG&A. And then what happens is that then they got to go out and try and be competitive in the market. And of course, there's always downward pressure on price, in order to capture business. Those folks are going to have it the toughest, and so their position on the graph is going to be different, and their position vis-a-vis the living wage is going to be different than somebody who's insourced. Somebody who's insourced doesn't have to pay a supplier's margin. So, the same cost that they may pay on a per hourly wage to an outsourcer, they may be able to apply that same per dollar rate to an internal person, and instantly that person is going to be earning, $4 an hour above the living wage or something like that. So in my experience, that's typically, the decision of a manager's individual context and how they figure that out. And that really is the meat of the discussion, right? Because at the end of the day, we're still in business. And even in our own centers, domestically, our goal, we start somebody at the living wage, where they are. So in Philadelphia, it's $12.69 an hour. That's for single person living wage, 2019 numbers from the MIT calculator. Arizona, where we're currently looking at putting a center in Arizona, $12.77. Okay, so a little bit higher. So we sort of look at it and make a determination that way. The big difference in a fair trade model is that you commit to be a living wage employer. You will not go below that living wage. Okay. Now, the challenge for any contact center manager, and this kind of goes to a lot called the agent journey. The challenge as a contact center manager is that somebody starting in that seat, that's starting. What are you doing to get that person into either higher level work, where they may be earning $3 or $4 above the living wage, but still being an individual contributor, still producing for a client, or how do you get them to be a supervisor or a manager? Because once you kind of get them and find pathways to get people into higher level work, then you could start paying them at the living wage if they have kids, right? And we keep coming back to this concept of kids because it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference in what the living wage is. So that to me is really how we start our evaluation. That's kind of the how we decide what wages to pay. And then I think to answer your question of do contact center managers do they care about single person versus family? And the answer is your goal should be to go from single person to family, and that's what we've set our goal to be. How many people can you get from single person to family? How are you changing so that you've got the room to make that move? And that's where I'd like to see us head. So.
Well, that's great. So what I'm taking away from this is that we're still in somewhat speculative area in terms of all of this because it's new, because you're kind of spearheading this, and this is a new road to hoe, but it's a fascinating one, and one that should be, in fact, studied more, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that. So it's still somewhat speculative, but there's some stakes that are being put in the sand that can be actually utilized for analytical purposes to do it for those people who want to do what you're talking about. And the other thing is that there's kind of a layered evaluation on the situation. You've got to understand, okay, are you if you're an outsourcer, you're in one situation. Basically, the career path is inside of the outsourcing operation, and it's a call center outsourcing operation. So there's a possibility to move people from being a frontline agent to a higher paid supervisor, but that's somewhat limited. There's some situations where it's an in-house center, and there's numerous companies, a lot of companies, probably people, on this call, who use the call center position as an entry level to then spread people out among, throughout other departments in the company, and where they may be able to take that step up and increase their wage levels. And so, that's where they could be moving from, a single person level of compensation to a family level of compensation. Insurance companies being very typical of this, where you go from being a contact center agent to going across the way to, helping out with adjustments and all kinds of other things. So really fascinating sort of analytical construct that you put together here. What are your other thoughts there while I get my thoughts together for some more questions here?
So, I want to go back to I think the how is incredibly important, and I'm hoping we get some questions so we can actually kind of mull on specific examples. But I want to talk about the how in the case of a captive company, right? So what happens if the finance department is coming at you and saying, we need wage savings, within the call center, and how do you respond to that? And in that particular case, I want listeners to think about sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So your site may be cited, somewhere, right? So let's say, your site is cited in San Francisco. I don't know of any call centers in downtown San Francisco anymore, but, let's say that you've got a call center in downtown San Francisco. And
I know one.
Okay, good. Well, I'd love to talk to them because I think they have a lot of favorable economics to take advantage of by moving that site. So, in that case, really what happens is that once your finance department tells you to drop wages below a certain level, and it's not necessarily the living wage, but, you want to think of it as a living wage. Once that happens, what happens is that, that wage level within your call center actually becomes a material risk, to the contact center, and then depending on the contact center's function within the business, to the business. Because what happens is that dropping a wage below that threshold to where the life of the agent becomes so economically insecure that they can no longer function in their job, you're really sowing the seeds of significant problems within your operations. You really are. Does that make sense, Bruce?
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen that in certain employment basins where people, this happens, for instance, on a very practical level, where new call centers will come into an area, and all of a sudden somebody who was a traditional employer who's not offering the same wages is basically priced out, and expenses, that the development of the community itself means that real estate prices are going up, everything's going up, so actually the cost of living goes up. And so the phenomenon that you're talking about does happen. So the agents both have their lives become less secure, and they have the enticement of higher wages from the new entrant. So absolutely, it's a very, very practical thing. Yeah.
And the great part about that phenomenon, I want to add, because I think it's important, is that the signal through the noise as to when that's happening and really starting to be a problem is your attrition rate. If you make a wage change or finance requests a wage change or other types of changes to save costs and your attrition rate goes up, well, then you have your answer, right?
Right.
And you know that there's a link, between how you're endangering that person, how you're economically endangering that person's life, and your own operation, because you're just going to leave in search of something that's actually sustainable and hopefully gets them on a path to a sustainable life. So.
Right. They're great points. And we're going to go over to Alan in a second because he's got a couple of questions there, I think. But we were in advising a company, a very large Asian company with a call center in the United States, and they found themselves in a situation where they were offering less than the prevailing rate, but they needed to find some way to, satisfy everybody inside the company. We actually came up with a way that people could earn themselves bonuses by upskilling themselves and becoming more efficient with their calls, while at the same time keeping up high quality and customer satisfaction, which they had the technology to measure on a near real-time basis. And so it was somewhat sophisticated in terms of the sort of dashboard we put together for them, but it worked. So there are ways that you can do that and actually allow somebody to earn themselves the living wage that they need and still stay there and be happy about it. So anyway, really, really fascinating area, Mike. We're going to have to do some more talking about this afterwards. But Alan, I know you've got a couple of questions there, so why don't we turn things over to you?
Yep, we got the first one here from James. And the question is, I have just been given responsibilities for our operations in North America, Ireland, and India. Comp is a problem in all of these locations. How do I harmonize my approach to wages among these areas?
Okay, first of all, congratulations to you, James, for getting that promotion. That's a big responsibility. And over to Mike now to reply.
I go back to those two. I go back to the subject of this, of this episode, as well as to that core evaluation. James, you've got to evaluate all three markets separately, according to the living wage and the market wage, and understand where your wages are in relationship to the two. A couple things to keep in mind. Number one, do not rely, for your North American operations, do not rely on national statistics. The American economy is diverse. It is vast. It's so different regionally that you cannot rely on national statistics. Frankly, you can't do that in Canada either, right? So that's cautionary tale number one. Cautionary tale number two is for India. So for India, I want you, James, to look up the Global Living Wage Coalition. They've done amazing work based off of the work of two married economists, whose first name skipped me, but their last name is Anker, Anker. It's called the Anker methodology. And the Ankers developed a methodology for evaluating the living wage globally. And so even within India, if your call center is in Mumbai versus a second, third, or even fourth tier city, you're going to have significant differences. So the most important thing you got to do, James, you got to get to that. You got to get to that local market data. You got to get to the local market data in all three of those economies, and you really got to get to the answer. Once you do that, because you could set a policy like we've done that says we're going to pay the living wage. That's a global policy that we've done, James. The living wage, we know what the living wage is in Ghana. We know what the living wage is in the two cities in the Philippines in which we operate. We know what the living wage is in Philadelphia and Arizona. We're looking at Mexico. We know what the living wage is in these parts of Mexico. So, the living wage is harmonious. It really is a harmonious policy in whatever economy you drop it into, as long as you go and you get the data.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, no, this is obviously the challenge of doing all this is puts an added burden on the management, but it can also solve management problems. So in a sense, there's the dual sword side, if I can put it that way. On the one hand, you make an ethical commitment, but you're also solving a practical business problem, because you don't want that high turnover. You don't want the attrition that Mike was talking about. So those two things come together.
Yeah, and hopefully it's not a leap of faith for James. I mean, it's not a leap of faith for him, because ultimately, and this is the benefit, is that it's completely defensible. When you root your compensation policy in the economic reality of the economies in which you do business, finance is going to really have trouble pushing back. They're really going to have trouble pushing back. And that's why, in the outsource industry, by the way, that's why margins in the outsource industry are typically below 10%, right? And when you see, I was just looking at a resume for an operations executive the other day, and he was kind of on his resume, he was listing his accomplishments, and he was listing his accomplishments as, I got, another 2% of profitability out of this center, and I got another 4% profitability out of that center. And I'm like, that's not a turnaround. I'm sure he's a competent person. That's not a turnaround. That's not that's not something where you've really stabilized and delivered real value, to your business. You've done the best within what you were handed, but you've got to peel off that next layer of the onion. What is really the thing that can do the best, for me and for my company. And at the end of the day, and Bruce, this is what I love about the living wage. At the end of the day, the living wage is about people's lives. Mm-hmm. Because it's consumption-based, it's about how people live their lives and what is reasonable and what is not. What is moral and ethical and what is not. And I'll tell you, Bruce, to take a little bit of a tangent here, it wasn't until I started visiting, which I've been doing for about 3 years now. I started visiting my agents' homes in the Philippines and now in Ghana, till I really got enough of my own kind of small sample set of data to understand what a middle class, household looks like, what really, a lower income household looks like, what an abject poverty household looks like, and what a high income household looks like. The beauty of the living wage is that it of the human issue, really the human aspect of our business. As a contact center manager, your job is to get performance from humans, from people. And so how do you expect to do that if you don't understand their lives, if you don't understand how they're living their lives? And that's why I'm such a large proponent of the living wage. And I think James has got a lot more opportunity since he just took over, to make a real difference in his, I'm sure, hundreds or thousands of people's lives, than he may know. And so, James, thank you very much for the question. And please, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to, help in any way I can.
Well said. Well said. No, and obviously, what are we here for, right? We're here to make a difference in people's lives, and doing it through our work and through the relationships that we, form with the people we work with is so important. I think we've got time for one more question. So, Alan, do you have one there?
Yes, I have one here from, it looks like Bryant. He's asking, we are in a city that wants a minimum wage over $15. We can't pay that much. I feel powerless. Any advice?
Move your center. Resite your center. The local economics are just going to squeeze your business. You unfortunately have to make that type of radical change in order to capture economics that are actually sustainable for your business and for what you're trying to accomplish. That's unfortunately the only answer. Economics is like math. 2 + 2 always equals 4 unless you're in some sort of alternate dimension or something. But I think the other thing not to be flipped to consider is simply, and as an outsourcer, this is a big part of what I consider of what I do. We get asked to give prices, all the time. Like, we'll offer X and somebody will come in and they're like, no, we want X minus, 2 or whatever. Part of what fair trade is that it has to be sustainable. It's more damaging for it's actually better for the people in that instance. It's really better to kind of, send the people that are currently in that center that's got an above $15 an hour minimum wage. It's better to send them back out to the labor market to find sustainable work in their local economy with the skills they've accumulated at your business than it is to try and lower their wages, and keep that center operating within that local economy. That's just economic facts. So in that case, you're almost doing more damage than good, by trying to keep wages below the living wage. You gotta move that center because it'll be sustainable, for the people that are there, as opposed to the risk that you're running right now, which is that it's unsustainable. And we face it in our own business all the time. We will not take a contract where we can't pay the living wage. We won't do it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, listen, this has been great, Mike. Great insights, a lot of forward thinking there that you've done. And the one thing I might add on here is that automation is going to become a factor in the discussion and in the what people do and what decisions are made going forward. But I think that the concepts that you put forward so nicely and clearly, were very stimulating. We've really just touched the beginning of the iceberg. There's a lot more to discuss here. We'll do a third time, Mike. How's that sound?
Love it, Bruce. I always love talking to you, so no problems at all. Happy to do it.
Okay, good. So thank you so much. And Alan, we'll hand things back to you.
Thanks again to Mike Dershowitz and Bruce Belfiore for your great discussion on today's show. Be sure to join us next month for another great show and look at our huge selection of archive shows and topics at BenchmarkPortal.com. Then click on CallTalk, where you'll find over 10 seasons of this show. From all of us here at Benchmark Portal, Keep those headsets steady and your fingers ready. This is Alan Potcotter signing out. Have a great day.